Hey Psych230 students, it's time for our week 3 check-in video. So at this point, we are kind of in the middle of our steep climb in the class. So for most people, chapters 6 and 7 start to get a little more difficult. We're starting to get a little more complex. It's also building on each other. So you may have noticed that in chapter 5, we learned, the z-score formulas. And then in chapter 6, we added probability and the unit normal table into that. And then in chapter 7, we changed our formula slightly to deal not with individuals, but with samples. And so then we're working not with individual scores, but sample means. At this point, this is all going to now culminate in chapter 8. In chapter 8, we are going to officially be doing inferential statistics. We are going to continue using the z-score for now, and we're going to use it as a way to determine the answers or try to come up with answers to our research questions. So chapter 8 will take all of those things we learned, like the z-score formulas, probability, the unit normal table, and it will combine it all into a process or a series of steps, which we call hypothesis testing. Technically, it's known as null hypothesis significance testing, NHST. So in chapter 8, I will say first off, chapter 8 is the most important chapter in the class because it is the concept. It covers all the concepts and the system of doing hypothesis testing. This is where we really start to do, technically, the scientific method and officially use inferential statistics to help answer our research questions. So a couple things just with the scientific method is that, one, the point of the scientific method is it's not the people. Like, scientists are not the scientific method. The scientific method is a method. It is a strategy. It is a series of steps that we take to try to get to the truth. Scientific method is one way to try to get to the truth. And I would argue it is a strategy that works incredibly well, in particular because it minimizes the impact of human cognitive biases. We all have these biases that our brains just try to take shortcuts, try to minimize as much energy use as possible. So if it can kind of guess what the answer is going to be, it'll just jump right to that. But sometimes it gets that wrong. And so the scientific method really kind of helps prevent us from coming up with answers that are not correct because of our biases. So one of the things it's going to force us to do is to phrase everything in terms of hypotheses. So a hypothesis is just a prediction. So we think A will cause B. Well, that's great. Sadly, most humans, once they come up with a belief that A causes B, they'll just believe it. But science forces us to test it. So that's why we're doing hypothesis testing. We're going to make a prediction based on our belief that A will cause B. We're going to set up a study where we're going to do A to our participants, and then we're going to measure B to see if A caused something to change in B. So we're going to test whether A causes B. So that's what's called hypothesis testing. The other piece that can be a little bit frustrating is that the way the scientific method works is we don't actually ever try to prove our hypotheses. We're going to test them, but what we've learned is the best way to test them is to try to disprove them. If we try to prove them, we often just come away believing wrong things. It is called confirmation bias, and there are different things that you can look up online, but yeah, if we rely just trying on to prove our hypotheses, we will often come away feeling like our hypothesis is supported when it really isn't. The only thing that seems to work effectively is to try to disprove our hypothesis. So what you're going to see is when we make hypotheses, we're going to have two of them. One is the hypothesis that we're thinking, like I think A causes B. So let's say instead of A and B, I'll say I think psychotherapy reduces depression. Well, that's technically going to be called my alternative hypothesis. And it seems weird because that's what I'm thinking, but it's the alternative hypothesis because that's not the one we're going to test. What we're going to test is the disproof of my belief. So in this case, if I believe psychotherapy reduces depression, I just think of not added to that. So instead of psychotherapy reduces depression, psychotherapy does not reduce depression. That is what we call the null hypothesis. It is the not of our alternative hypothesis. Technically, what you're going to find is that in the scientific method, that's the one we test. So we're going to kind of go into our statistics and the way we run our studies with the assumption that, yeah, psychotherapy will not reduce depression. And then we're going to test that. And ideally, we find data that doesn't support our null hypothesis, which then might mean that it supports our actual alternative hypothesis. But if we find data that does support our null hypothesis, we should probably just stick with the null hypothesis and conclude that psychotherapy does not improve depression. So what you're going to find in this chapter is probably tough. It's a big chapter. There's a lot of information in it. And it's hard to get your head around. This is the part where your brain often will start aching a bit. So one of the things that I want to just sort of warn you of is that the language is part of the issue. Sometimes we're talking alternative hypotheses and null hypotheses, and you're like, what's that? And then we make decisions where we're going to reject the null hypothesis or we're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis. Those are struggles because they're double negatives. So to reject the null hypothesis, to reject something is to say no to it. The null hypothesis says there's no treatment effect. And so we're saying no to there being no treatment effect. Why do we have to phrase it that way? Well, because it's technically correct. But we can kind of shortcut it and say, well, the two no's cancel each other out. And so we're probably arguing then that the treatment has an effect if we reject the null hypothesis. However, if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, that's a triple negative. Fail something is to say no to it. To reject is to say no. And the null hypothesis says no to there being treatment. So we're saying no to there being no treatment effect. Two of those no's cancel out, so we're left with one no, and that would be there's no treatment effect. So if we fail to reject the null, then we're coming down and saying, yeah, the null hypothesis is probably correct, and in our case, psychotherapy does not reduce depression. Okay, so if that makes your brain ache a little bit, you're normal. So just know that some of this is it's gonna take time for the concepts to sink in because the language is goofy. The language is actually super accurate, but you have to really kind of understand it at a deep level to see why it's accurate. So part of this is just gonna be practice. One of the nice things is that the system of hypothesis testing that we're gonna learn in this section is the same system we're going to use every chapter from this point on. So all that's really going to change, essentially it's like 4 or 5 steps depending on which textbook you're using. And basically only one of the steps really is going to change all that much. And that's the step that has the calculations. What's going to change? The formulas. We're just going to have different formulas for different statistics. But otherwise, the other steps basically remain the same. And so that repetition of those same steps will help as you go through the rest of the semester, that a lot of these concepts will start to sink in more and more because you just kind of seem to need that extra repetition with it. Couple other things regarding this. One, again, chapter 8 most important, so spend a lot of time on it. 2, we're only doing chapter 8 this week, and then we're doing chapter 9 next week. I will tell you, if chapter 8's being a bit of a struggle for you, chapter 9's not so hard after doing chapter 8. So if you need to, because the chapter 8 problem sets are due at the end of this week, you might take that grace period and just extend it into the next week so that you can, again, spend a little more time on chapter 8. I think you're going to need a lot more time on the chapter 8 concepts than chapter 9. Chapter 9 isn't so hard. But you can, again, play that by ear yourself. Last thing I wanted to show you was grades on exam 2. I've got most people have taken that tests, and so we had 17 people. I think only 4 people haven't taken it yet. There was one person who started it very late, and so they got timed out. So I'm not including their score in our average. So because it was a really low, and they only had like a half an hour to do the test. So for those who had the full time, average score was about a 90, 89.2. The median is 91, so half of you scored above 91, half of you scored below 91. 91 is going to be our better measure of center, and that's because the distribution is skewed as it usually is for tests. It tends to be a negative skew for most tests because you can't get it higher than 100%. That's part of the reason you get this skew. Average deviation from the mean, or our standard deviation, is about 10, almost 11 points. A little bit more than last time. So what we're starting to see is we're starting to see more differences within our class in terms of their performance on the test. Variance is just the average squared deviation. So again, that's the one that's not really easy to interpret directly. Interquartile range, IQR, is 13. So basically you take the 75th percentile and subtract it by the 25th percentile. So we've got those here. 75% of people scored 98 or below. So that's our 75th percentile. And the 25th percentile is 85. So 25% of people scored below 85. So if you subtract 98 by 85, you get an interquartile range of 13. The range, so not from the interquarters, the third and first quartile, but from the highest score to the lowest score. Our highest score, we had a couple of hundreds. Lowest score so far is a 66, so that's a range of 34 points. And then finally, we've got our skewness as a negative 9.936. So this means it's a negative skew. If we look at our distribution here, you can see that. So we had a number of scores that were perfect, and then a lot in the 90s, a lot in the 80s, and then a few in the 70s, and then the one in the 60s, right? These were the scores, so they're a frequency table just for the scores that we have. So we had 3 perfect scores and 3 people with 98s. And then other thing we have here is just our box plot. And so with that, we can see, whoops, let's get this over. With that, you can see that that's the median, there's the mean, there's the interquartile range, and then you can see that most of our scores are up in here, and then we just kind of get this spread and a little bit more spread between people. So, you know, we were having some people where just, again, struggling a little bit more than others. All right, so that's the video for this class. So, again, as always, reach out to me if you have any questions, but hopefully this will be a little bit, give you a little bit more time because I want you to spend the time to understand Chapter 8. And then pretty much we're going to be doing 1, at most 2 chapters per week from this point on. So we've kind of gotten some of that stuff that I would argue is a little bit more review stuff out of the way. And so now we can spend more time. And so hopefully you'll actually find that class kind of levels out and you start to get into a groove a bit after Chapter 8. All right, take care.